Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. Today, the History Guy tells two stories of American political assassinations at the turn of the 19th century. First, he talks about the only assassination of a sitting U.S. governor. Then he talks about the former governor killed by dynamite. While they happened in different parts of the country, together they illustrate some of the biggest political battles of the time, and the lengths that some went to get their way. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
As a successful attorney and Kentucky State Senator, William Goebel took on the interests of the powerful railroads and the wealthy elite of the Gilded Age. But along the way, he made enemies. The political career and assassination of William Goebel, still the only sitting U.S. governor ever to be assassinated, is history that deserves to be remembered. William Justice Goebel was born in 1856 to German immigrant parents in Pennsylvania. His father served in the Civil War on the Union side, leaving his mother at home with 4 children. She taught them about their German heritage. William spoke only German until age 6. His father was discharged from the Army in 1863 and moved the family to Covington, Kentucky, just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. William eventually decided to become an attorney and apprenticed with former Kentucky Governor John Stevenson from age 15 to 21. He graduated from Cincinnati Law School in 1877. He eventually became Stevenson's partner in his law practice. Stevenson was chief counsel to Kentucky Central Railroad, and Goebel became an expert in contracts, corporations, and railroads. He went into his own law practice to address alleged abuse by the railroads and negligence in the courts. Many overworked, injured railroad employees and widows came to him for help. Settlements were large, and he became quite rich. Goebel also defended railroad employees arrested in the 1894 Pullman strike. He didn't charge a fee, became hailed as the railroad lawyer and the poor man's lawyer. In 1887, Kentucky State Senator James Bryan decided to resign his seat and run for lieutenant governor. Goebel decided to run for the seat because it represented Covington. He ran on a platform of railroad regulation and support for organized labor. With a popular platform and the support of Stevenson, Goebel assumed that his election would be easy, but ran into problems because the Union Labor Party was running on a similar platform and appealing to both Democrats and Republicans. Goebel ran as a Democrat, won by just 56 votes. He came to a Kentucky Democratic Party that was on hard times. Republicans had come to the state to break white rule during Reconstruction. The economy was poor, workers' wages were low, farmers were in debt, and taxes were high. Goebel was not a Southerner. His family had fought for the Union. He was not the typical Kentucky Democrat. He believed in civil rights or blacks and women, and he added a populist agenda. There were only 2 years left in the term Goebel was serving, so Goebel had to make a name for himself quickly. His first bill reduced the tolls on Covington roads owned by a corporation, favored more regulation and reforms. Voters loved him, but he made the ex-Confederate ruling class angry. He served on a committee to investigate lobbying by the railroad industry. Its lobbyists had attempted to get the legislature to abolish the Kentucky Railroad Commission. Goebel's committee uncovered abuses by lobbyists, such as giving free passes, money, food, whiskey to legislatures. He helped defeat the bill to abolish the commission, became quite popular in his district, and easily won re-election in 1889 and 1893. In 1890, he served on the committee drafting the new Kentucky Constitution, secured a passage putting the Railroad Commission in the Constitution, and thus insulating it from the legislature and attempts to abolish it. But Goebel made enemies in the process, and that nearly cost him his political career. The Kentucky Constitution included a clause banning anyone who had participated in a duel from holding office, a leftover from its days as a western frontier state that had a dueling problem. It also required public officials to swear an oath that they would not fight any duels. Goebel nearly ran afoul of this clause in 1895. John Leathers Sanford, a former Confederate colonel turned banker, was widely believed to have cost Goebel an appointment to Kentucky's highest court in retaliation for Goebel leading legislation to lower the tolls in Covington, costing Sanford a lot of money. Goebel wrote an article in a newspaper calling him Gonorrhea John. Sanford was angered when Goebel led a group opposed to increases in the tolls on the bridge between Covington and Cincinnati, one of his investments. And the last straw was when Goebel transferred 3 accounts from Sanford's bank to another. Sanford was heard saying he was going to kill Goebel or be killed. On a trip to the bank in Covington, Goebel and his colleague were stopped by Sanford. While talking, Sanford kept his hand on his pistol in his pocket. Goebel held onto his pistol. Sanford asked Goebel if he wrote the article, and he said he had. Both men fired at each other, but witnesses were not sure who fired first. Goebel had turned at the last moment, and Sanford's shot went through Goebel's clothes, or as the Cincinnati Enquirer explained, passed through his coattails, trousers, and underclothing without drawing blood. Sanford was shot in the head, just above the right eye. He died 5 hours later. Goebel turned himself into police and was investigated for murder. He pled self-defense. The coroner's inquest agreed. It was a stroke of good luck. Had he been convicted of participating in a duel, he would have been banned from holding public office. In 1899, Goebel received the Democratic nomination for governor. During the election, he campaigned against the Louisville and Nashville Railroad and talked about his opponent, incumbent William Taylor, and his cozy relationship with the railroad. Goebel asked crowds if they wanted the railroad to be the master or the servant of the people. In 1904, the chairman of the railroad admitted that they spent $900,000 to attempt to defeat Goebel. On November 7, 1899, Taylor beat Goebel by a narrow margin of just 2,383 votes. Goebel was gracious in defeat, but his supporters were not. Democrats in some counties began making accusations of voting problems, and Goebel was persuaded to ask for a recount. Under the Kentucky Constitution, contested elections were to be decided by a contest committee made up of 11 members of the legislature. The committee, drawn by lot, included more Democrats and favored Goebel. Taylor sent for supporters to come to Frankfort, and thousands of armed mountain men from eastern Kentucky answered his call to intimidate his opponents in order to take the election in his favor. The Louisville Courier-Journal declared, "Armed mob of mountaineers invade Frankfort to bully the legislature." On the clear and cold morning of January 30th, 1900, Goebel walked to the old state capitol in Frankfort, despite having been warned of an assassination attempt. He had 2 bodyguards with him, including Captain E. Lillard, warden of the state penitentiary. As they reached the State House gate, a shot rang out. Goebel uttered an involuntary exclamation of pain and attempted to draw his revolver, but his strength failed him and he sank to the sidewalk. Several more shots followed, but no one else was wounded. Goebel was carried 2 blocks to the Capitol Hotel, where a doctor, E. Hume, had an office. The doctor immediately recognized that the bullet wound, which had entered above the right breast and punctured a lung before exiting next to the spine, was mortal. Goebel was taken to a room on the 2nd floor of the hotel. The shots were fired from the direction of a 3-story building in which a number of state officials, including Governor Taylor and Secretary of State Caleb Powers, had offices. When Taylor was told of the event, he seemed to be horrified and decried the assassination attempt, but as Goebel's supporters started to come to Frankfort, he called out the state militia in order to preserve order. The militia formed so quickly that some people were suspicious, thinking that he'd already planned to call the militia for some unknown purpose. The state teetered on the brink of a civil war for several days. The Democratic majority in the legislature tried to meet, but Taylor had them forcibly dispersed. Taylor then ordered a meeting of the Assembly himself, but called them to London, Kentucky, a Republican-dominated area. The Republican minority came while the Democrats did not, resulting in the Republicans not having a quorum. Taylor tried to keep the contest committee from meeting, but they managed to outwit him and meet in secret. On January 31st, the contest committee declared the injured Goebel the winner. The Republican minority was angered, as were voters in Republican districts. Taylor remained defiant. Goebel was sworn in as governor from his sickbed. Knowing that Goebel was not long for this world, his lieutenant governor, J.C.W. Beckham, was also sworn in. Goebel's first order was to disband the militia called up by Taylor. The call was ignored by the Republican commander of the militia. Beckham, as acting governor, then replaced the adjutant general of the militia with one of Goebel's men, who formed another militia. For a while, Kentucky had 2 governors, 2 lieutenant governors, 2 adjutant generals, 2 militias, and 2 legislatures, all continuing to do business as if the others didn't exist. Taylor remained defiant. He tried to draft bank vouchers to pay his militia, but the president of the bank refused the payment. He pardoned a prisoner in the state penitentiary, but the warden, who had been with Goebel when he was shot, refused to free the prisoner. Taylor continued to use his militia to forcibly prevent the legislature from meeting. When a judge sent an order restraining him from doing so, he had his soldiers arrest the man serving the order. Goebel died from the gunshot wound on February 3rd, 1900. Journalists said his last words were, "Tell my friends to be brave, fearless, and loyal to the common people." His lieutenant governor, Beckham, was sworn in, but the standoff with Taylor continued. With Goebel dead, Democrats and Republicans tried to negotiate a compromise on the election. Democrats would get the governorship for Beckham. Republicans would remove the militia from Frankfurt, and Democrats would give immunity to any Republican official involved in the assassination. Taylor, however, did not want to leave office and refused to recognize the agreement, turning to the courts. When a warrant was issued for the arrest of Caleb Powers, Taylor's Secretary of State for the assassination, Taylor protected him, instructing the militia to block him from being arrested. Powers managed to escape Frankfurt wearing a disguise, trying to get to a Republican area, but was caught by the sheriff in Lexington. Ultimately, the Kentucky Court of Appeals said the legislature acted legally in declaring Goebel the winner. Taylor appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, who refused to hear the case, allowing the Court of Appeals' decision to stand. Out of legal options, Taylor stepped down, and J.C.W. Beckham became governor. 16 people, including Taylor, were indicted in the eventual case about the assassination. Taylor fled to Indianapolis. The Indiana governor refused to extradite him, so he was never questioned about the case by Kentucky authorities. 3 of the men accused made deals to testify for the state in exchange for immunity. 5 went to trial, and 2 were acquitted. Caleb Powers was convicted, along with Harry Utze and Jim Howard. Prosecutors said Powers was the mastermind, Utze was the intermediary, and Howard was the assassin. The trials were highly irregular. All 3 judges were pro-Goebel Democrats, and the jury pool was light on Republicans. Republican appeals courts overturned the convictions of Powers and Howard. Powers was tried 3 more times with 2 convictions and a hung jury. Howard was also tried and convicted again. Utze was sentenced to life in prison and did not appeal it. After 2 years in prison, he became a witness for the state. In Howard's second trial, he testified that Taylor had conspired with Utze and Howard. He admitted that he acted as an intermediary and supported the prosecution's theory that Taylor and Powers were the masterminds and Howard the assassin. Despite the 3 men spending some time in prison for the crime, the assassination of Goebel has never been conclusively solved, and most historians think that the identity of the assassin and any plotters will likely never be discovered. After serving 8 years in prison in 1908, Howard and Powers were pardoned by Beckham's successor, Augustus Wilson. Powers went on to be elected to 2 terms in the United States House of Representatives. Utze was paroled in 1916 and pardoned in 1919. Taylor was also pardoned by Wilson, but he rarely returned to Kentucky and became a successful lawyer in Indiana. Goebel was an unlikely politician in Kentucky. He wasn't even a native, wasn't part of the traditional power structure of the Gilded Age. He didn't give rousing speeches. He excelled at working behind the scenes to get his agenda passed. He took on powerful railroads and corporations in his home state, and while he wasn't part of the ex-Confederate ruling class, his populist agenda attracted voters. He remains the only sitting governor in U.S. history to be assassinated, a victim of the powerful wealthy of the Gilded Age.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. And we'd like to welcome Betty Jo, my grandmother and the history guy's mom, back to the podcast. You know, this is an amazing story. As all the stories we look at, we always pick great ones, but this pair of stories that we're looking at today is wild, especially because it's almost totally forgotten. This is a period of history that I think a lot of people, it gets glossed over in the history books. I think people understand that there was labor unrest in the United States, but to the level of what happened, say, here in Idaho, this is a former, a retired governor, and he's assassinated with dynamite, and I don't know when people are told about this, anything like it. It's not brought up in most of the when you talk about, issues with labor, they don't talk about the time that this former governor was blown up by a booby trap because of his opposition to labor.
Part of the fun of being the history guy is that, you get to learn about. I mean, I have degrees in history. I never heard any of it. I did not hear either of these ever mentioned in any history class that I ever took. And they really do represent the era.
Yeah.
It's not that these are just, odd events. They're both just crazy stories. It's crazy what's going on in these states. But these did really represent the big challenges of the time. Largely at this time, a populist challenge, a challenge of labor, and a lot of the development of the West. So it's because we like to talk about the Wild West. We think about the Earps or the Indian Wars or whatever, and really it was a lot of it had to do with these labor struggles. And really, what did that mean? The people that were populating the West thought differently than the people in the East, and they were more populist. They were more egalitarian. People had gone west to escape those structures, and that led to these challenges. Of course, you don't have a mine if you don't have a rich person to build the mine, but you don't have a mine if you don't have poor people to mine the mine, and that always led to conflict. But they're also they're crazy. Both these stories are they're whack. They're out of control. Something's wrong with people. And so I think that part of the lesson here is, if we think, if you hear people today, they'll think America is more divided than it's ever been. It might be more divided than most people's memory. Yeah. I mean, I guess that depends, because I think we sometimes kind of forget what the 1970s were like. But certainly it is not more divided than it's ever been. It's not more divided than the Civil War, but it's really, this turn of the century, it's the Gilded Age is coming along, and this kind of conflict. You couldn't imagine that today. You could not imagine today in a contested election that someone's answer would be lean out the window and shoot the guy.
Right? It's absolutely wild. And these are the things that, this would be big news today if any of this happened. We're talking about straight up terrorism in
Oh yeah. Well, 2 governors, 2 legislatures, 2 militias, 2 militia captains, or that's insane. We don't even in all that we have today, and there's a lot today. There's contested elections today. Arizona was just still arguing over the Arizona election, still arguing over Georgia and the cycle before that. And for all of that, the answer was never that both of you raised up an armed militia and used it to literally keep the legislature from meeting.
But one of the other really interesting things is that these are forgotten stories. We don't remember them. We don't know anything about them. And today we know what happened 3 minutes ago. And so you always have to remember that communications has made all the difference in the world as far as how we react to things and how we see things. And in those days, I'm sure that they knew that things were split or that people didn't agree with each other. But just think about the whole concept is different because we have instant news.
Yeah, you didn't have a news cycle here. You didn't have 24-hour. You didn't have people looking at their cell phones going, "Oh, what's
true."
going
Just
on?
being on the other side
the
other side of the state would have made it a different experience. You would have been at a distance from it. And today we'd have people filming every piece of it. There'd be a witness, iPhone videos from every angle, and it's a very different.
It's true. We would see it different. So maybe division today affects the whole nation, and the perception of the nation maybe faster than it did then. But so the thing that we have these these 2 stories that are a good distance apart between Kentucky and Idaho, and they both did involve the presidency and national politics at the time. But that shows that these still were representing national trends and national divisions. And both of these stories going to end up, tying to some of those same divisions, though, in different ways. But it is, when we talk about it, it's just amazing. How can these be forgotten? Because understanding this and understanding the nation survived this and understanding how the nation survived that might be meaningful in days when we have political division and disagreement and elections that are in dispute and all the sorts of things that led to these. It's interesting because in Lexington, there is a brass plaque on the ground that says this is where Goebel was shot. Yeah. And I wonder how many people walk over that plaque and have no idea who William Goebel is, more or less outside of Kentucky.
Yeah. And I wonder if in Kentucky, do you suppose if you're in a duel today, they can take you, that you can't no longer be governor?
You still can't run.
I wonder how many of those laws still exist, because I thought that was really funny too.
If you're in Kentucky and somene's going to run you don't like, challenge them to a duel.
Yeah, apparently if you get them to fight a duel, they're ineligible.
But I guess. We talk right now. You'll have candidates on both sides where the other side has said they love that guy so much that he could literally shoot someone dead in the street and they would still vote for him. That literally happened in Kentucky. He literally shot the guy in the face and then ran for governor.
Yeah, that one. It's shocking because you hear that and you're like, oh my gosh, he shot a dude. In public. I don't know how you think it would make it difficult.
The big question was it a duel? That was the real question. Was it a duel? That was what they were worried
really
about.
Care if the guy died. It would be an interesting. It would be an interesting. Of course, we don't generally. I mean, they were. Kentucky was not exactly the frontier at that point, but more so maybe than New York. But
yeah, more so. I mean, I'd say it's a mountaineering state. I think. I mean, it was certainly were a little bit more rough and ready in the nation, and at the turn of the century there. But he got shot right through his underwear too. Yeah. I mean, you have to appreciate how lucky he was that this guy was able to shoot in a way that literally pierced his underwear and didn't draw blood.
He managed to, and I mean they were close.
They had to have been. They had to have been standing right next to each other. But angry words turn to gunfire. That's never a good thing. But I mean, it's not something we would expect of someone that's running for governor.
No, it would be pretty crazy for someone who was running for governor, for a political person to literally get in a gunfight. Although also I think that today we kind of view that a little differently. Now we've got it's a very different world than it used to be.
It is, yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, we've talked about the Hamilton duel, and I mean, that's things have just kind of changed with time. So, we I guess less frequently deal with our political issues via gunfire. It's not like it's completely.
No, it's still a political, but it's maybe not the same political issue that it used to be.
It's maybe not the same. Yes, they're probably not shooting literally out of the window of the governor's office. That's
that one.
We don't know that. It might have been from the Secretary of State's office. We're not sure which window they were shooting.
That's something
from.
We might know today, just because we would have some video where you could see the shot coming through or something.
That's true. Yeah, so they would have a clear idea of who it was that was shooting at each other there in front of the captain of the prison. And yeah, this story. It's kind of crazy for out, but it's really interesting because Goebel was he was such a political outsider. He was challenging the traditional structures. He was presenting himself as a hero of the common man. And that's, you always see that. I mean, those sort of populists always rise, and you see them in all sorts of eras of history. And, whenever you challenge the status quo, then there's going to be some kickback. And it's interesting where they both found their support base. And you can laugh certainly about the politics of it. When you question an election, when he decided for a recount, they didn't actually go recount the votes. They just by lot drew 11 members of the Kentucky State House, and then they decided, and obviously they were going to decide based on their politics. So then you're just wondering who's drawing the right straws. I mean, that's all around bizarre. But in the story that he's the only sitting U.S. governor to have been assassinated, of course, the story is that he wasn't actually a governor when he was shot. He was only a governor, but he was a governor by the time that he died. Is really, I mean, this whole story is crazy, and it's crazy that politics could get so acrimonious. Yeah. That it would come to the point that your armed militias are facing each other, and yet despite all of that, I mean, the only violence that occurred was this assassination. Yeah. I mean, it didn't erupt into. Gosh,
you sure think it could have? And I mean, these were you want to talk about partisanship? Yeah. It would be crazy if one candidate in, say, a gubernatorial candidate in the state calls in the Democratic militia, and the Republican militia is a different entity. It doesn't quite work like that.
And you name, and you got different judges, and you got, I mean, they're all, but and they're so, I mean, there really could have been a civil war here. Oh, yeah.
And I just love the fact that we had two legislatures, we had two governors, we had two everything, which is just absolutely, just think about what that must have been like and who followed whose orders and so forth.
I know, yeah. What if you had to, pay
how do
taxes?
the bank guy, the bank president says, "Oh, I'm not going to honor the check. You have to pay the militia. He's got to make a decision on that.
And the captain of the prison doesn't accept the pardon, and so I mean, you've divided up the offices by who's taking what side, and it's kind of hard to see in this whole story here if there was any truly neutral party.
Yeah. No, everyone seemed to.
I mean, it's not like they go to some court or something like that where someone's saying we're going to try to easily adjudicate this based on the law. I mean, they're all. I mean, it was no question when you selected your legislators senators by lot what they were going to vote, regardless of what the vote count was. And the way to prevent that was to literally use the armed people
to try to keep them from
meeting and voting.
You can see how that felt like it feels like a system that's really rife for abuse, where if you're like, oh, well, I lost the election, well, all I have to do is ask for a recount. And apparently that's enough.
Yes, and then hopefully my guys will
get more
will be
on
the ones that.
That's crazy, and that's certainly not the first time. All the time you'll have places where throughout American history, and honestly throughout world history, where there's a position where there's a committee of 5 people or whatever, and it all comes down to which side gets more people.
Yeah, making that decision. Yeah. Though, I mean, to be fair, it doesn't sound like Goebel was really trying to game the system. It sounded like he was convinced that there was the election irregularities. Gosh, what does that sound like? Oh my goodness.
We've got some.
The other guy was sure he had been elected. It was a very narrow election. Gosh, we never see anything like that happen these days. So I mean, it is important because we just not told the story, which I don't know why. It is important because it says that this nation has faced more division than we have today, and we managed to come through that. It is important certainly as a lesson to learn. I mean, probably the best way to solve things is not to raise 2 militias and try to see who's got the most guns. There's a lot of, but it also is it's a ripping historical yarn. It is a drama of all sorts to see what's going on throughout. And prison escape. I mean, you can look at the best plots that we see on television shows, and they really aren't as crazy as this one. And there's many things happen. So you're like, how could that happen? Why would that continue happening? It's one of these things that would be hard to write as a story today because people might not necessarily believe.
Yeah, that we could really.
And they shoot him, and before he bleeds to death, they make him governor.
Which at that point, it sounds like they knew that the wound was mortal.
Mortal.
I mean, when they weren't doing that thinking, oh, maybe he'll recover. It didn't seem like that was. It seems like everyone thought that was unlikely. But they're making a point of, and I'm not sure exactly what point they're making, except that how dare you shoot our guy in public? But
maybe the point was we don't want the guy who shot him to be governor.
I guess that's fair, right? You still
by virtue of shooting the opponent
to make a
or maybe he was a dead man walking, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he, I guess to an extent, he sacrificed his life in order to come to a conclusion on this the stormfront that they had run into. This.
It does show just how national these labor issues were, because the 2 stories we talk about today are about 2 very different industries that were in very different locations, but they were fairly similar in terms of what the actual foundational argument was about, and the fact that this is a guy who was he was not a typical politician, and he was able to make a name for himself essentially in politics by picking the side he picked as a lawyer.
Yeah, absolutely. Labor was really the biggest issue of the day, especially as things grew in the West. And Goebel was standing for railroadmen and railroad rights, and that's what got him there. And you do have to wonder, because we'll talk about Sternenberg in a moment here. You have to wonder, if he had been governor, would he having to work with all those diverse state interests, been able to maintain that degree of loyalty, because Sternenberg is going to find out in a bit that it's kind of hard to stay on one side versus another. So to an extent, Goebel maybe couldn't have been anything but a martyr. I'm not saying it was a good thing he was shot or anything like that. I'm saying that maybe his political path was set, and maybe that shows in the fact that he'd had the violence before in terms of the shooting match between he and a rival. Yeah. So it seems like he was on a path kind of from the start, and that's where the path ended up.
If you support the History Guy and would like to find more of our content, one of the best ways to do that is to go to thehistoryguy.com. That website has all of our content. That's going to have our podcasts, our videos. It also, as our catalog has grown, it has got a very nice way of being able to kind of look through the many different things we have done and find how some of them are connected in different eras and different stuff like that, which can be a little harder on YouTube when all we really have are playlists.
Yeah. So if you want to say search by topic or search by source or the name, it's a much easier way to do it. It's an easier way to get to all of our content rather than waiting to see what YouTube is going to recommend. It's a good place you can go to buy our t-shirts or make a contribution to the History Guy if you want to. And all sorts of content there. And so easy, it's thehistoryguy.com.
Next up, the history guy talks about the assassination of former Idaho Governor Steunenberg.
112 years ago today, on December 30th, 1905, retired former Idaho Governor Frank Steunenberg went for a walk around his neighborhood in Caldwell, Idaho, through nearly 10 inches of December snow. As he strolled that frigid December morning, you can imagine that, like millions of others, that he was thinking about the possibilities for the new year. When he returned home, he opened the side gate to his yard, and it exploded. While he was gone, someone had rigged the gate with several sticks of dynamite. Blown nearly 10 feet in the air, the governor was grievously injured and died in his home later that day. The assassination of Frank Steunenberg made national headlines in its day, and the trial that followed, a national sensation, included some of the most famous advocates of the day arguing over one of the most contentious issues facing the young nation. It is a story of the wildest part of the Wild West, and a part of the nation's history that many people would rather forget. And yet this now nearly forgotten political assassination deserves to be remembered. As much as we think of the West in terms of cowboys and Indians, outlaws and lawmen, and settlers crossing the nation in their covered wagons, the history of development in the American West was actually largely driven by minerals. The discovery of gold in California in 1849, the famed gold rush, drove the westward expansion and the overall development of the United States perhaps more than any other single event. The California gold rush was followed by many more, from the Black Hills of South Dakota to Tombstone, Arizona, to the Alaskan Klondike. Many U.S. western states, including Nevada, Colorado, Idaho, Arizona, Montana, North and South Dakota, and Alaska, were originally settled not by farmers, but by miners and prospectors. And while many of those miners headed west hoping to strike their fortune, the vast majority ended up working in a profession that was dangerous, grueling, and where power was concentrated in the hands of the mine owners. Attempts to unionize labor in the American mining industry began as early as the 1860s, although early attempts tended to be short-lived responses to specific complaints. In response, mine owners formed mine owners associations intended to protect the interests of the mining companies. A seminal event in the escalating conflict was a labor strike in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1892. The central labor complaint had to do with automation replacing miners and reducing wages. But the situation escalated when it was discovered that the Mine Owners Association had infiltrated the miners' union with a detective, allowing the mine owners to outmaneuver many of the union's plans. The use of these so-called labor spies, in this case a detective from the famous Pinkerton agency named Charlie Siringo, was a particular bone of contention. The discovery of the labor spy led to a violent confrontation, with striking miners exchanging gunfire with mine guards and replacement workers called strikebreakers. 3 people were killed and 17 injured in the violence. In response, Idaho Governor Norman Bushnell Wiley declared martial law, deploying both troops of the Idaho National Guard and later federal troops. Many union members were confined without formal charges in the 4 months of martial law. The heavy-handed response resulted in the formation of a new, better organized, and more militant union organization called the Western Federation of Miners. The WFM would then play a central role in the many violent mining labor disputes in the United States and Canada in the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries. The WFM led strikes in Cripple Creek, Colorado in 1894 and Leadville, Colorado in 1896, both of which resulted in the deployment of the Colorado National Guard. While the former was largely successful in achieving its goals, the latter was not, and resulted in an evolution into a smaller, more radically socialist, and more violent WFM. This would set the stage for another labor dispute in Coeur d'Alene in 1899. In 1896, Idaho had elected a new governor, a former newspaper editor named Frank Steunenberg. The 36-year-old Steunenberg had won the nomination for both the Democratic and the Populist Party, and had won the election on the back of significant union support. He was the first Idaho governor who was not a Republican, and mining company fears that he would not support them in a labor dispute was enough to cause them to raise wages. He easily won election to another 2-year term in 1898. But trouble flared in 1899. The Western Federation of Miners was having a dispute with 2 mining operations that chose to pay a lower wage and operate only with non-union miners. The WFM perceived these 2 mining operations to be a threat to their wage scale. On April 29, 1899, union members from the WFM used nearly 3,000 pounds of dynamite to destroy a mill belonging to the Bunker Hill mine. So much dynamite was needed that the union men commandeered a train at gunpoint to move it all. The mill contained a huge concentrator used to refine ore into silver. In the blast, the WFM destroyed the most expensive piece of mining equipment in the United States, worth more than $250,000 at the time. The local sheriff supported the union and did nothing to prevent the violence. Shocked by the extent of the damage and the lawlessness, Stunnenberg appealed to President William McKinley for federal troops, declaring Shoshone County, where the event had occurred, to be in a state of insurrection and rebellion. Once again, martial law was declared. The response was heavy-handed, including indiscriminate arrests where hundreds of men were herded into so-called bullpens without trial or the right of habeas corpus. Some were held in inhuman conditions for as much as a year. Politicians sympathetic to the Union cause were arrested. Newspapers critical of the federal response were closed down. The power of the WFM in the area was broken. One of the Union supporters was convicted of murder in the death of one of the Bunker Hill employees, and several were convicted of the federal crime of interfering with the mail for the abduction of the train used to carry the dynamite. For his action declaring martial law, Stunnenberg was seen as a traitor by the unions that had helped to elect him. He did not seek re-election in 1900, but enmity against him clearly remained. 5 years later, when he was killed by the booby trap on his gate, the WFM immediately fell under suspicion in the assassination. 2 days after the explosion, January 1st, 1906, a suspect was arrested. The man, named Harry Orchard, had been staying at a local hotel. A waitress reported that he had acted suspiciously on the day of the bombing. A search of his hotel room found further evidence that he had made the bomb. The lead investigator, a famous Pinkerton detective named James McParland, convinced Orchard that he would be better off if he became a witness for the state. Orchard then told an astounding tale. Not only had he killed Governor Stunnenberg, but he admitted to 17 other murders, all at the behest, he claimed, of the leadership of the Western Federation of Miners. The trial of WFM leader Big Bill Haywood, held in 1907, was one of the most dramatized of the day, called by the press the greatest trial of modern time. One question regarding the mine leader's arrest in Colorado went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The prosecution included future U.S. Senator William Borah, and the WFM leaders were represented by the legendary attorney Clarence Darrow. After nearly a 3-month trial, Haywood was acquitted, largely because Orchard's testimony could not be corroborated. In the end, only Harry Orchard was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The trials of the 3 WFM leaders in the assassination of Frank Stunnenberg ended up being sort of a watershed in the American labor movement. While the trials themselves offered plenty of drama and there were accusations of misconduct on both sides, they ended up being sort of trials on the idea of organized labor in the United States. And the acquittals represented not just the fact that the jurors could objectively appreciate facts, but also showed the growing sympathy for the populist movement in the Western United States. Still, there are many who argued that the jurors were intimidated, that they were afraid that their families would face violence if they convicted. And to this day, there's still disagreement over whether the WFM was involved in Stunnenberg's murder. Ironically, the acquittals might have represented sort of a death knell for the radical tactics of the WFM. Exhausted after years of violent confrontations, including the notorious Colorado labor wars in 1903 and 1904, labor had soured on violent tactics. And the acquittals themselves showed that labor members could get fair trials in the United States, which itself undercut much of the rationalization that was used to justify those violent tactics. In embracing more radical socialism had alienated many of the former allies of the WFM, and so by the 1910s, the Western Federation of Miners had lost its position as a leading voice in the labor movement in the Western United States. In 1916, they changed their name to the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers and enjoyed a brief resurgence in the 1930s and 1940s, but their association with socialism cost them during the Red Scare of the 1950s, and finally, with declining influence, they merged with the Steelworkers Union in 1967. Harry Orchard was sentenced to life in prison for the murder and died in the Idaho State Penitentiary in 1954 at the age of 88. He maintained throughout his life that his confession and implication of the WFM leadership was true. Big Bill Haywood's fame in the labor movement grew after his acquittal. He eventually split with the WFM as the union moved away from more radical socialism and aligned himself with the Industrial Workers of the World, which he had helped to found. In 1918, he and over 100 other members of the IWW were arrested under the Espionage Act for instigating a labor strike during wartime. Facing up to 30 years in prison, he skipped bail and fled to Russia, where he became an ally of the Bolsheviks. He died in Russia in 1928. The once trial of the century has largely faded from the national memory, as has the period of violent labor confrontations at the turn of the 20th century. And yet that period, when violence was common on both sides, represented significant changes in American culture and law and established the industrial labor movement in the United States. And for that reason alone, that assassination of Frank Stunnenberg on a frigid December morning in 1905 deserves to be remembered.
I feel like in this episode, as you're telling the story, the intro is so shocking because it's just this guy walking around. He's going for a walk, and then he gets blown up by dynamite, a booby trap of dynamite that was set up while he was gone.
That's pretty harsh for someone to put several sticks of dynamite in your garden fence while you... Well, I mean, it does start out quite startling because he's out taking a walk when there's 10 inches of snow.
That's true, which is a choice.
The real lesson on both of these is don't go for a walk because that's when it goes bad. But yeah, he goes out for a walk in 10 inches of snow. What's the worst that you think he's going to get pneumonia or something like that? He opens the gate and he's blown in the air. So yes, this was a political assassination, and it was done to make a statement. Yeah. And boy, it did. So I mean, again, if we want to talk about how divisive things are, very little, a small percentage of our politics today deal with dynamite, whereas this particular episode has quite a shocking amount of dynamite. More sticks than should be necessary to kill one guy, and more sticks than should be necessary to make a political point.
This certainly was not them just trying. I mean, man, if you're going to kill a guy, there are ways to do it that are a little less dramatic, right? This was a statement, and and it was a very clear statement. I think that you use dynamite as an assassin from the mining union. You're
10 foot in the air.
Yeah,
yes.
you're making it very clear. This was us.
Allegedly, because the union always denied it. Maybe he was just a crazy guy with sticks of dynamite for some reason. But and again, this was a former governor that was killed because of acts that he took as a governor. I never once heard a mention of this name in getting a degree in United States history, and it's a very, I think, unknown event. But it did represent not just the politics of the time. I mean, when we talk about the labor unrest of the time, there's a lot of things that people talk about, including the mine wars in Colorado. But it represents maybe the apex of those wars because it really was the events around the Studenberg assassination that would kind of change the trajectory of labor and kind of represent the end of that very volatile, very violent era of labor dispute where there were a lot of guns involved. And so, I mean, nothing we talk about with labor today, even the messiest disputes with labor today. I mean, they don't involve having to hijack a train to carry all the dynamite.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, that's well, and it's really it's hard to say exactly who was a good guy in this because I can kind of see where everyone was at. I mean, we kind of see how the union was radicalized, where they they feel like they don't have any support in the government and that their only choice is, and you can see where when the federal troops come in to and they're essentially only they're clearly taking a side.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, you can see why a pro-union governor would eventually have to call in troops just because of the level of violence. You can see how the union would see that as a betrayal. But you also see as soon as they got there, as the military got there, I mean, they're just randomly arresting people. They're just shutting them away in camps forever. I mean, you can see here how this could spiral to where it did. It's really, and it's kind of interesting because the real core of the dispute that ended up in all of this really had to do, it's a weird detail sort of thing. So in Idaho there's wet mines and there's dry mines. And the wet mines, people were literally working waist deep in cold water. Ooh. And in the dry mines, you were working out of the cold water. So that when you worked in the wet mines, they paid you more because you had to buy special equipment, these overalls, rubber overalls, I guess, to not freeze to death in the water. So the dry mines say we can pay less per day, but the miners still make more, but we would be not paying the minimum union wage, and so we had to use non-union miners. So that's an interesting discussion. You can see what one miner might say, I would be willing to take a little less pay if I don't have to buy the pans and stand in the water. And that was the dispute where the union saw that as a chance at union busting because you're using non-union workers and breaking their wage agreements, which they had fought for so hard. And that's where the tension comes from. But it seems, I mean, you can see like two sides of that story. And it does feel like a bit of an extreme response to then blow up the most expensive piece of mining equipment in the United States.
And that's, and you want to talk about, where in terms of, who was on whose side, they blow this place up. And I mean, they blow it into smithereens. And like, they don't, at first they essentially are saying, we're not going to do anything about that. Like we're just going to let them go.
Well, the sheriff was on their side, so he wasn't.
That's crazy. Could you imagine a sheriff today Why somebody goes and I mean they turn that thing into matchsticks, and the sheriff
Yeah.
refuses to arrest him.
Well, and kill the
Yeah.
person too. I mean, kill the yeah, and then they're mad that the governor, does something about it. It's also interesting because we were in the midst of the Spanish-American War. He couldn't call up the state militia because they were in the Philippines fighting, and so we had to send troops. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, again, this was just a really crazy. If we're going to talk about division, imagine a time when what the labor dispute is. Well, I disagree with you over wage to mine, so I'm going to literally blow your processing plant to matchsticks with someone inside there. That's crazy. Yeah, this one again, it's crazy. And then they become so mad over the response, which, to be fair, feels awfully heavy-handed by the time they do it. Of course, it's hard to call the army into a domestic dispute and have that be anything other than a fairly brutal response, because that's not what the army's built to do, right? But anyway, so they're so mad about that after the guy retires, they wait till he goes out on a walk and they blow up his fence. It's all around a crazy story.
It's wild how deep these loyalties and grudges. I mean, hell, is that this was years after it was several years after he had retired, and he was essentially out of the game. He was, and yet it was a political assassination.
But they saw him as betraying the movement. Yeah, it was clearly a political assassination based. So it really was what he did as governor that led to that. And it's interesting because he had been you imagine he didn't lose his sympathy for the Union. You just can't. You can't let them just blow stuff up that they don't like.
If you let them do that, I at some point there's just where's the rule of law? But it's
there's got to be. So I mean, it shocked even his conscience, and he felt they had to move to the rule of law. And some of these things, like now, it's against the law. It would be a significant violation of the law for the owners to infiltrate the union with a spy.
Yeah, which is crazy stuff. Although I bet they still try to do some of that. Although at least it would be against the law, and you can see where these. I mean, you can really see where the mine owners who seem to have all the power and the money and stuff, and who are admittedly at odds with the workers. I mean, that's been true. I mean, throughout history, but especially once you get into industrialization and stuff like that, and you can see why so much of that turned to these Bolsheviks.
Well, and down in Colorado, the experience had been, darn near civil war. The experience had literally been, armed groups on both sides, and then a lot of death from Union troops, massacres by militia and troops. So you can see how they had radicalized to that point. But it makes a difference here when we find out where Big Bill Haywood winds up. It's a little different than we see today. I mean, there were people that were literally seeing this in the same way that the Bolsheviks were seeing it in Russia. And they were seeing this as a revolution, and I think they would have been willing to call up the Red Guards, just like Russia was. So this was kind of the apex of that. They'd had all the violence in Colorado, and that had, for some of them, said violence is not working, and for others it had radicalized them. And so that something like the dry mine pays less than the wet mine could lead to something as dramatic as 3,000 pounds of TNT or dynamite, that then could lead to something as dramatic as killing a former governor who's out of the game with dynamite. It's all around crazy. And then, of course, it goes into the whole trial story. The person Orchard is he knows that he did it. But he is claiming that they killed lots of people. It leads to another trial, and it's and all of that in the end comes down to it really takes the violence team out of the labor movement, moves it a different direction, so that we still have labor unrest. We still have significant labor unrest after this period, but it is moved away from the point where that is kind of armed camps in what is close to civil war. And away from something that looks like a Bolshevik revolution.
I'd like to think we're a little more civilized now. I prefer either way, whether your argument wants to be in, whether things have gotten better or worse or whatever. I think in general we're in a better place when we can, when a strike doesn't involve armed gunfights. In general,
we still see labor action obviously in America, and after the period of this, it's been regulated in so many ways that are intended to. The whole idea is that we learned how terrible it could be, and it was intended to to serve both sides without it turning into the massacres and things that we had. really much more violent. Our whole vision of what the Wild West looked like these times, after the turn of the century, much more violent than Wyatt Earp whacking people in Dodge City and stuff like that with his with the butt of his gun. So I mean, it's just a period of U.S. history. I mean, it's interesting that we don't think of it in the same way that we think of other parts of U.S. history. I mean, how wild and woolly this was, that you were using dynamite on the former governor, It just says, again, the lesson that we learned from all of that is that we can disagree and not have it turn into that sort of violence. So in an era when, it's not all that uncommon to have people in the street upset over things, maybe the lesson we need to learn is go relearn the lessons of these forgotten events and say that, we can be very much divided as a nation, and yet we can come to solutions as a nation that don't tear the nation apart. Because we did that, we tried it, and we learned that it was worse.
And then one of these days we might find Jimmy Hoffa. Who knows?
he's underneath the mine. I mean. But yeah, even if you talk about the Hoffa era, I mean, still, the dynamite wasn't usually involved. I mean, I don't know. Well, we have no idea how many.
As far as we know,
we have no idea how many assassinations were ordered by the unions, in either era.
Might be the reason we can't find Hoffa.
Oh, maybe so. That's right. Maybe dynamite wasn't.
It's certainly, this does come off as the unions inside, and this is true in other places too, where this concentrated power could come off as, this was almost organized crime. The level of, it was essentially what they were doing.
Of course, yeah. And what's more organized crime than being able to call up your own militia? There's all sorts of accusations on both sides in labor disputes and stuff like that today, and sympathies for the nations shift back and forth between labor and management and all that sort of thing. I think there've always been arguments about connections between unions and union busters and organized crime and power, and the rich versus the poor and the working man versus the management, and all those issues are still around today. But if we think that those issues are crazy today, if we think those issues are radical today, if we think issues between populists and power base are radical today, then honestly we've not seen anything like that, like what the nation has already survived. So I would say, as a historian, and I usually just like to tell history and let people make their own decisions, but I would say one of the lessons we learned from this is don't be that. Let's not do this again. Right? Let's not shoot from the windows of the courthouse. Let's not use dynamite on our enemies. Let's not blow things up as our means of solution. Realize that we can have differing opinions without tearing the nation apart. Because it does seem occasionally these days that people have forgotten those lessons, and maybe that they should hear in class about William Goebel and Sternberg and what it means when we take our politics the wrong direction.
Certainly, the solutions we have are not always perfect, and you can see in places like this where the solutions were imperfect that led us to where we got. But you have to think that we're still better off if we're not blowing each other up.
Yeah. We learned lessons then. We changed the way that we did things then. If we have to learn lessons now, that's fine, but let's not learn them the same hard way that we did before.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.